Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. A very warm welcome again at this webinar, Beyond Recycling, the Circular Opportunity for Passenger Cars in Europe. We're really happy and excited that you join us today on this very important topic that we're discussing. My name is Mark de Wit. I'm Director of Business Engagement at Circle Economy. We are an impact organization with 60 people helping businesses, cities, and national governments to become practical about what it means moving to circularity. And as I said, the topic today is of crucial importance because mobility at large globally is responsible for about 1/10 of all the materials we use. It's responsible for about 1/3 of all the emissions we generate. So it's of crucial importance that we find ways forward to fix that system. So what are we going to discuss in the next hour or so? I'm going to kick us off with a highlight and really kind of a high-level overview of what is the importance and what is the connectedness of mobility connected to other topics in a circular economy. Then I'm going to hand over to my dear colleague, Jacco Verstraeten, who is going to moderate a panel discussion, and he's going to introduce the panelists to us. We would very much like to hear from you going on for the entire hour, but we have carved out some time towards the end of the webinar where we'd like to exchange with you, with the audience, in terms of your questions, your remarks, your best practices. So please do share those with us. And then we're going to conclude and close the session in an hour from now. So that's what we have ahead of us. But as I said, I would love to kick you off quickly before we head on. And let me also turn on my camera for that. So what we, of course, see today, and actually already since the last couple of years, is a very unsettling image in terms of what we are faced with, both when we look at the business environment, but also in our personal lives. Looking, for example, at the ramifications of 2 years of lockdown, the situation in Ukraine, and the ramifications those have at the moment. For example, record inflation, an energy situation that is really putting a lot of pressure on a lot of systems. So in short, what we are confronted with is really a magnifying glass on some of the cracks in our economic system that may have been there for quite a long time, but we're seeing at the moment that they really come to the surface and that they're hitting us hard. So I think one element of moving to this circular economy is the idea that we need to move to a more resilient system. So it's really that we're currently at that tipping point and seeing if we want to tweak or temper that linear model or wholeheartedly kind of pivot to that next model. Because we are confronted with what that linear economy has brought us, and just watching the close of the Sharm el-Sheikh, the Egypt COP last week, yes, there has been progress on some fronts, but we also see that there are many challenges unresolved in that situation. So we've seen what a 1.1 degree warming means to our global economy. For example, what you're seeing here, forest fires, floods recently in Pakistan, droughts, famine, really a lot of negative consequences on our environment, on our living systems, with huge ramifications to personal lives, livelihoods, but definitely also to industries. And of course, also there is a responsibility in that regard to fix that system. So what I think is crucial in moving forward is also getting the right insights and metrics on the ground that are able to provide where the broken elements in our system are, but also how we can fix them. And at Circle Economy, we every year launch our Circularity Gap Report, which gives our focus to that future or to that future situation. And this is a material X-ray, as we call it, of our global economy. And what you see here in this image is how 4 basic materials, minerals, ores, fossil fuels, biomass, how they satisfy 7 basic human needs, because it ultimately, our whole economy is geared towards satisfying needs like housing, like mobility that we're discussing today, like nutrition. So this is our attempt to show that. And if you go to the next slide, Jacco, what I wanted to focus on is that currently into that system are about 100 billion tons of stuff every year that we use as a global economy to satisfy those basic needs. And if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is that we use those elements to indeed satisfy basic human needs. And what you see here in the middle is how these materials satisfy those needs, and also where some of these big ticket items are. For example, you see mobility here in terms of material footprint consuming almost 1/10 of what that situation looks at. And now if you go to the next slide, what is interesting to look at as well is how, after we've used those materials, what happens to them? Where do they end up? And you see here that quite a considerable amount is being emitted, like majorly is the case when you look at mobility and also car travel, the fuels being combusted and going and being emitted in the form of carbon dioxide. We see plastic, for example, being dispersed through rivers in our oceans. We see that we consume quite a bit to basically build up our economies for more people living more prosperous lives on this planet. About 1/3 is wasted, and of that, about 1/3 again is cycled back into our economic system. So you could conclude based on this that our current economy is about 9% circular. And if you now go to the next slide, Jacco, what I think is more interesting, and this is really going to be the focus of today, is on the solution side. So how can we stay compatible, for example, with the Paris Agreement, steering the planet on a 1.5 degree pathway? And what we looked at a year ago were 21 solutions to really do that job. And what you see here in the red bubbles is everything related to mobility. So looking at reducing our travel, using different materials, moving to electrification, innovating in terms of business models. So there is a big part of this global picture that we can solve and that we need to solve looking at mobility specifically. So going to the next slide, what we have done over the course of the last year is we wanted to double click on this global picture and really zoom into a couple of sectors. So together with Bain Company and a circular economy team, we have looked specifically at Europe to 3 sectors: the construction sector, the automotive sector, and machinery and equipment sectors. And if you go to the next slide, what we're going to focus on in the next 45 minutes or so is this study, Beyond Recycling, the Circular Opportunity for Passenger Cars in Europe. So with that, I would love to hand over to my dear colleague, Jacco Verstraeten, to introduce us to the panelists, to kick us off to the publication and take it from here. So Jacco, floor is yours.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for that introduction. And happy to take it over from here. Welcome, everybody, also from me. I'm really happy to talk through some of the results that we have uncovered in our report together with Bain Company on the automotive industry. And I've got 2 very good panelists today to walk through some of the results. But let me first walk you through some of the main findings. What I found interesting of this report is that it had a very a dual message. On the one end, it showed that the automotive industry is definitely not new to the topic of circular economy. It's been on the agenda for a while, and they have a few points where they perform very well, such as 78% of materials are being recycled at the moment. And at other parts, there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's definitely also some issues that we've uncovered. A lot of materials going into the automotive industry, for instance, are still virgin, so non-circular materials. And if we look at the goals that are set by the major players, there's still a lot of ambition needed to get to where we need to be. I'll spend a few minutes walking through more of the specific parts. Then I'll go and introduce our panelists to you, and we'll have a bit of a panel discussion. In the meanwhile, do feel free to ask already some of your questions whenever they pop up in our Q&A module, and we'll be happy coming back to them later on. I'll start here. So what we've done in the report together with our partner Bain is that we've developed a bit of a snapshot of the current value chain and the material flows going through it. We arrived at the conclusion that the current sector is 41% circular. So that means that about 40% of the materials are kept into the loop, and 60% or near 60% is wasted, is lost, and their value is lost. And but they're also, of course, impacting the environments that they're lost in. We found 4 major points where you could see that happening. First of all, what stood out for us is that if you look at production volumes, the current industry is very much focused on the production of new vehicles. That's twice as much as they're producing, for instance, parts to repair old vehicles. And even from those parts that are being used to repair and remanufacture cars, only 2% of those are actually reused or remanufactured pieces. So a lot of the, so not just the cars are made from a lot of virgin materials and a lot of new cars, but also the parts that are being produced for repairs are mostly new. There are not a lot of reused elements there. And if you then look at the use phase, you also see that there is a big transitions happening there. We're moving to electric vehicles. We're moving towards shared models or what they call mobility as a service models. But that transition is slow. It's a bit sluggish, you could say. So these movements are there, but they're not going very fast, in our opinion. And then lastly, I already mentioned shortly at the beginning, we do see that the industry is quite committed to recycling. It publishes its own reports where it says it's about 85% circular. But if you then really look into the efficiencies there and how much is kept within Europe, but even more important, how much is kept within the industry, it actually drops considerably. And you see that most of the materials are actually what they would call downcycled. They're used in less valuable applications in other industries. Hence, that the automotive industry is still using a lot of virgin materials. So it's not getting the materials back from their own recycling processes. Of course, we're not just doom and gloom. We didn't just look at the current situation and try to pinpoint where things will go wrong. We also asked ourselves the question, how can we improve on that? And say we take the year 2040, because we do feel that there is some level of ambition needed to get to where we need to be. And what if we would implement some major shifts in the industry? And what happened is then, if you looked at the metrics, we estimated that we could quite realistically reach a 66% circular. So we would go up from 41 to 66 by implementing 4 strategies, and I'll highlight them shortly. First, and quite obvious, is just using more secondary materials. So rethinking where we mine or where we retrieve our materials, go to what they call the urban mine, preferably the materials that are reclaimed from used vehicles, and just use much more secondary and recycled materials in production. A second one is that we could also look at better design. And that's is something that industry is already pretty good at. But of course, now there's a whole generation of new types of vehicles with battery electric vehicles coming up. And these are much more heavy right now because of the batteries in there and the new drivetrains than original cars. So we feel there's renewed attention needed to rethink that design and make it as optimal as possible. Hence also, of course, using as little materials as we can. And of course, what we also feel is that there should be much more attention to the reuse and remanufacture of cars. So how can you make much more use of the current vehicles out there and reuse parts of or remanufacture used vehicles to actually have the same quality as newly produced vehicles. And the fourth, oh no, there's actually a fifth as well. A fourth and fifth options that we looked into is, as you can imagine, the better uptake of mobility as a service models. Of course, like I said, we do see that transition already happening, but what if we could maximize that by 2040? And that would also have quite a lot of impact. And then at the end of the pipeline, what if we could look more towards upcycling rather than downcycling? So how can we improve the efficiencies in our current end-of-life scenarios, not just looking at the bulk metals that are currently already pretty well recycled, but also looking at some of the smaller elements, the more valuable elements. And of course, with the uptake of battery vehicles, also the reclaiming rare earths, and start reusing that within the automotive industry itself, rather than downcycling it to other industries. So this was really, in a nutshell, what we've been looking at. And of course, there's much more there, and I really would invite you to read the report for all the details. But for now, what we also would like to do is just discuss some of those details with my panelists. And I'll introduce them now. And I'm really happy that these two gentlemen are joining me today, because I think they're much better placed than myself to give some thoughts to what I've just presented. I'll shortly introduce them. First in my panel is Björn Noack. Björn is a partner at Bain, has been one of the main authors of this report, so knows all the details of what we've been looking into. He's been working already at a couple of automotive industries, such as Audi and Daimler, so has a lot of practical experience as well. Already for quite a few years has worked at Bain with a focus on the automotive industry. Thank you so much for joining us today, Björn. And then, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Björn.
No, just great being here. Thanks so much for the introduction.
Okay, great. Then I'm also very happy to be joined by Owen Griffiths. Owen is head of circular economy at Volvo Cars. Owen, we've met already a couple of times over the last period, and of course we've been discussing some of the challenges of going circular. And I remember that I went out of every meeting being quite inspired and impressed with how much you and your team are already doing in Volvo. So hence, I'm very happy that you were here today to just comment on some of our results and also give the insights of how an OEM like Volvo is looking at some of these challenges that we uncovered. So thanks for joining us today as well.
My pleasure, thanks.
And I'll just dive right into that, if that's okay with you, because we've got a couple of questions prepared, and hopefully we'll also get some questions from the audience. But I'll start with the first question to you, Björn, if that's okay. One of the things that we mentioned in the report is that the European industry, which was the focus of this report, the European industry is somewhat better positioned to going circular or going circular fast than other regions. Have you also encountered this in practice, and how can that benefit European businesses?
Yes, absolutely. So basically what we see, if you look at the data, that European OEMs are currently already at the forefront of circularity. This is accelerated basically by latest policy developments. So also here we see a clear shift from an initial focus basically on greenhouse gas emissions, then came batteries recycling, and now we clearly see also the focus on circularity, just as you described earlier, that we really move into a more circular system. I also see it really in practice in many projects that we do regarding strategy, regarding transformation. Circularity is really one of the key topics. And also here, in practice, it's clearly accelerated also by current supply chain constraints. So also OEMs are clearly seeing a high value in circularity and focus also on from a value kind of perspective. Yeah? And last but not least, I guess also for Europe in total, it could be really beneficial. It's not only OEMs that could really have advantages from cost savings, but also from supply chain sustainability and value creation. It's also the mobility providers that you use. So basically, we see mobility services increase dramatically by the 2030s until 2040. So there will be a whole new ecosystem, especially in urban areas. And then along the value chain, there's also additional players like the recycling companies, etc., that would profit strongly from this development.
So it's not just the OEMs you're saying, it's the whole chain that will have to adapt, but also benefit from
Absolutely.
this.
And I think that the acceleration right now is clearly that they see really a benefit. It's a value. It's not only politics that push OEMs or that push the value chain in that direction. It's the value that is now seen, and therefore everybody is really accelerating on the topic.
Oh, and I can see you're nodding. You recognize this from a daily practice? You don't have any challenges explaining this to your colleagues nowadays?
I think that we're quite well versed in the idea of climate action, and circular business and climate action support one another. And so when we're looking to where we need to be in 2030, the idea of increasing recycled content seems like a very sort of pragmatic and logical step forward, alongside trying to get access to low carbon raw materials. So I wouldn't say that we don't have challenges across the organization with the topic of circularity, but once we connect it to the climate problem, people see that there are some solutions that we need to put in place, and recycled content is a good way of doing that. I think we do have a challenge when it comes to talking about new commercial models or being more proactive in the supply chain beyond tier ones, or being more proactive in the life of the vehicles beyond the traditional relationship that we have with customers. And that's sort of like a short-term life cycle where we're providing mobility to new customers, for fleet customers for maybe 3 years, and Care by Volvo for 3 years. But then the servicing of the vehicles through the period of sort of 7-8 years, we lose a lot of customers. So we have to try and find new ways of providing solutions, and we're pretty good at things like remanufacturing, reuse, repair, refurbishment, but others are better than us. And so we have to find ways to build that into our corporate narrative as well, to be more circular and also support our climate neutral ambitions. The thing I would also flag then is we always put recycled content up there as this sort of answer to circularity, and I think we're finding, and we're going to find even more, that the access to this raw material is going to become more and more complicated. Organizations are already starting to try and secure quality scrap material and partner with smelters and metal suppliers, specifically in steel and aluminium. And if we look at the ambitions, you wrote them in your study here. Mercedes have got the ambitions, we've got ambitions, Renault have got ambitions. We've all got ambitions to be climate neutral and circular. So the access to this material becomes incredibly challenging. And so then we have to beg the question, how do we play in that new future? And I think that comes to sort of Bjorn's point, that this value chain is going to change. And how do OEMs connect to that is going to be really difficult. And we're trying to explore that at the moment. We're trying to understand what's the right level of involvement, the right partners to collaborate with. And what do we do where we have manufacturing facilities in different parts of the world where we may have a very small footprint. Volvo is a 1% of the market. In Scandinavia, we've got quite a high proportion of the market being Volvo cars. So maybe we can do something a bit more proactive. But in China, we're a minor fraction, and then in the US, even more of a fraction. Well, I don't know. We're small in both of them. So that's the other thing. But I also think the other benefit that recycled content has over the low carbon solutions for materials is that it has the benefits for other environmental and planetary boundary factors. And so I think what we're going to see on the horizon, and you sort of nudged towards it in the report, is climate action has set the scene for discussing planetary impacts. Biodiversity is now gaining momentum, and we're hearing about that being pushed more and more and more. Ecotoxicity, eutrophication, all these sorts of things are coming down the road, and CSRD, which is coming in 2025, is going to force organizations to be prepared for these. And then suddenly the pressure on access to the recycled content becomes even more pressing, because recycled content has more benefits from the other planetary boundaries than low carbon materials.
And Owen, of course, last week we saw the COP at Sharm el Sheikh with, well, at best mixed results. I think you also said that the whole climate change debate is really pushing the circular economy agenda forward as well. Would you still say that climate change is the major driver for looking at recycled content, or are the other topics like biodiversity or geopolitics also coming into the mix, and is really all of that is driving it?
Climate is well out in front. It's the big leader on the topic, and I think the benefit is for the automotive sector that we have to get other OEMs to transition and accelerate the transition to electrification, because if you look at the footprint of our footprint was predominantly in the life of the vehicles. Once you move to BEVs, and that's where we're thinking now, we've made the decision, we're going this route. What do we do next? Well, we look upstream. So we are focusing on the other factors, but it's hard. The data is fuzzier. The target setting is much more difficult. SBTI is forming the science-based target network, which is going to look at more of these factors, and so that might be more helpful. But no, climate action and climate change is definitely the pole position. The other thing to say is I think everything else will be quicker to get on the radar and get pressure on, because climate has taken this sort of leading light role, and that's good. The other one thing I would say, I thought the report was excellent, but I do think that one thing we should also be mindful about, okay, bear with me, is that the recycled content, the figure, the 40%, takes into consideration little, if any, impact upstream, like your global X-ray does. And so when we've done an assessment to look at what our footprint is and how circular we would be, we're more looking like the 2%, 2 or 3%, because of the resource use outside of our scopes. And so I would encourage you to consider an evolution of this document, which takes into consideration the resource consumption before those virgin materials hit us, so that the automotives don't raise flags to say we're already 40% circular, and you know what, our vehicles are 80 or 95% recycled at the end of life, so we don't have anything to worry about. Actually, we do. Material doesn't come back to us, and the resource consumption outside our supply chain, our scope 3, is pretty poor, and we need to do things about that.
So Björn, actually here is an OEM telling us that we should be even more alarmist in our report. And do you recognize what Owen's saying here?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I hear it not only from Volvo Cars, it's all the other players that really setting ambitious targets. we headed on a target setting. So as you said, first of all, OEMs are currently looking at what their scope is and looking at how much of the car is being recycled right now with quite high ranges. However, also stated in the report, if you look at how many cars go towards Africa and other countries and are not being recycled and not being circular at all, there's a long way to go also for the OEMs. So I fully get the point and the concern.
Yeah, and I can second that, because maybe good for the people with a bit more expertise on the call. The percentages in the report are calculated by the CTI methodology, the circular transition indicators, and that, like Owen says, does not take into account footprints, like scope 3 footprints, you would say, if you take the analogy with LCA. So Owen, I think you couldn't be more right on that as well. And there's a couple of other questions coming up also from the audience. One of the things that we also highlight in the report is that, of course, you need to look at recycled content and renewable content at the start of manufacturing processes. But one of the bigger changes could also be the adoption of more mobility as a service models, shared cars, but even going as far as, say, looking at robocabs, for instance. Owen, do you recognize what we wrote in the report, that adoption is not going as fast? And what do you think is holding us back on adopting more mobility as a service models?
Yeah, this is really important, and it's a really difficult area because it sort of fundamentally challenges the way that OEMs sell vehicles today. Volvo Cars has launched a system that used to be called M for mobility. It's in Scandinavia, and now it's renamed Volvo On Demand. So this has been our sort of endeavor into this area. I think there are some really standout challenges. The first one is that the vehicles that are put on the market have to be on our balance sheet, or the balance sheet of that organization. That's costly, and so you suddenly ask the question, how long can we hold them on our balance sheet, and how much money can we make through the life? And so you've got this quite complex economic question that organizations have to face. And so I think that's a challenge, but I also think that the financial sector is also quite keen to see vehicles as a pool of value, and so I think there is going to be some changes in that market, and I think it's a discussion that we need to have. How can vehicles be provided in a mobility solution that are well looked after, not necessarily old and decrepit, but provided throughout the life of the vehicle? So there's an ownership piece that's quite complicated. The second thing is the way that they're taxed. They're currently taxed certainly in Sweden as a taxi, which makes them quite expensive. And then the third thing is the demand. And what I acknowledge in your report, but I struggle to see in my day-to-day, is solid evidence to say that this market for sort of mobility as a service is there, it's growing, and we should invest more in it. I would love to see those data points, but I'm not yet. So that's one thing that I find is very difficult. But I do support the idea that that's the direction of travel. Our report that we published through Volvo On Demand last year highlights that one mobility vehicle displaces the need for 9 vehicles. So that's good. So we see this as a positive, but it's not easy.
Yeah. Björn, do you recognize this from your own practice, that OEMs are struggling with this transition?
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of data that really underlines this. Only if you look at how many OEMs are currently active in the field and how many are successful. So I think, like Owen, you said, a lot of the OEMs have pilots, have some offering, being it shared mobility, being it mobility on demand, and the like. However, we don't see many of them really succeed. The best example, I think, Mercedes and BMW just sold their share now activities. Volkswagen sold WeShare, their car sharing activities. So there's really a lot of OEMs that struggle with that type of business for the reasons that Owen just mentioned. However, on the other side, we also see new services rising, like subscription. There is a whole lot of subscription offering, and basically the different models that just converge. So basically the car rental, but also then the car sharing, the subscription is more or less converging over time, and it's just being different kind of services that are provided, and the customers can choose. And I think the real step change might come with the introduction of robocabs or autonomous vehicles that might just completely change the game.
Because that's indeed that's one of these innovations that is highlighted in the reports. RoboCabs. In all honesty, I did hear from them before, but I learned a lot reading that part. To the audience, Björn, that some might also not know in full detail what RoboCabs are. Can you explain real short what kind of opportunities you see there?
It's basically services provided mainly in urban areas by autonomous vehicles, being it cars or at a bigger scale pods, so people mover. So you might fit in 8, 10, 12 people in one of those autonomous pods driving around in urban areas. And it's basically replacing taxis, it's replacing the Uber cars, but it's also complementing public transport. Because you can reach with those autonomous vehicles then areas that a train or a bus line wouldn't reach. So it's really an enhancement of public transport at the end. We see the race depending on the availability of autonomous vehicles, basically in the 2030s, when this will really accelerate. So it's a bit to go still. But then there might be a substantial increase, for example, of vehicle utilization, because you can put a lot more people in those autonomous RoboCabs. You can then just utilize them a lot more, because what we also see is today, vehicles most of the times are just standing parked in front of your house or in front of your work. So with those autonomous vehicles, there will be a lot more utilization. And what we also see, since it's then handled as a fleet with a strong focus on total cost of ownership, there's also a high chance that people and fleet operators will use a lot more reused parts for the fleet and also extend the lifetime of those vehicles. So the mileage traveled of such vehicles will be much higher than today's ordinary cars.
What I really like about this concept of this future vision is that it's not just the circular economy, right? It's also about automotive transport. It's about different business models. Looking at one of the questions in the audience, and everybody, I would still invite you to keep on posting more questions. But one question connects to this. It's from Harpreet Bhatia. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And he's asking, what does that mean for the role of the OEMs? If we go to such models, would that make them, would they still be a car manufacturer, or would they be have much more of a coordination role, a value coordination role in the value chain? What do you think, Peter?
Well,
Owen, yeah.
I think one of the challenges here is about the life of these vehicles. I think early assessments suggest that BEVs, battery electric vehicles, are going to last probably a shorter period of time than electric vehicles, unless batteries are switched. The question is whether this is going to be something that the organization is going to be able to do cost effectively and then get the return on investment for, or whether this is something that we let the industry sort of the market sort out. The other thing is that the components that are in the vehicles that we put in today have life cycle, like we have durability requirements that are long. We have a long life cycle for the majority of the components. So the question is, how many of these components can we really take out and assume that the technical cycles are not going to increase faster, so that we're still going to be able to use a component from 15 years ago? And so this is something I've learned coming into the automotive sector. If I was to tell my colleagues that what we're going to do tomorrow is design a car for 2027, where the shell of the vehicle is going to be used again in 2043, they would say, hold on, how do we know what the vehicles are going to look like in 2043? And then I'd say, well, you know, we'll be perfect. The next vehicle will be perfect. We'll get it right. And then they would say, well, that's what the people in 2020 thought, or 2010 or 2000 thought, and we've changed it so many times. And so the technical cycle is so that you will not be able to use all the components again, and certainly not in running production. So that's a real challenge. And so we sort of have to come to this question mark. when do we have high enough utilization that we can say that it is providing enough utility, and then design the vehicles for multiple cycles like Bjorn was talking about, so that these components, that these products that last 10 years are supported by 50% components that can last indefinitely, and then we flick them out and it fits for a Volvo and it fits for a BMW and it fits for all these things, and so some harmonization. But then on the other side of things, where we're trying to provide mobility for people that live in the countryside, then it's really hard to see a mobility solution that can fit for them. So we need to provide as long life of a vehicle as possible, and then to say that those that vehicle or that product will be sold with components that were from a vehicle that was produced 15 years before it was placed on the market is quite hard to imagine. And so therefore we have to leave ourselves with some room for a heavily recyclable vehicle and a highly efficient recycling strategy. And so it's a struggle. It's a struggle. I'd like someone to lay out to me how this is going to look a little bit more before I could say that we're going to know what the answer is really.
Yeah, and I can imagine, I mean, one thing for us as researchers to see, like, what are the big levers for change is something entirely different to actually implement that in daily practice, I can imagine. Good. Also looking to you, because we discussed this kind of shared mobility as, from a circular economy's perspective, and how that changes the business model or the use phase. In the report, we also looked at all the implications for climate change. Was the mobility as a service, did that also have a lot of impact on climate change, or is it really for the other reasons that we should be pursuing this?
In my opinion, mobility solution has also massive impact on climate change. So just by the levers I described, higher vehicle utilization, higher use of reused parts, and then simply, as Owen said, you replace a lot of vehicles with one mobility service vehicle. So, and if you look at the models that are currently being tested and developed by OEMs, like GM is operating with Cruise, like Volkswagen is currently testing with Moya. So there are already those vehicles in place, typically all being fully electric, typically all being 8+ seaters. So really focusing on having more people in the vehicle. And then clearly with a vehicle lifetime that much exceeds the lifetime of the current cars. So I think it really, if we think about the mobility service differently than not just saying it's normal cars as we know them today applied to a service model, but really also think about new types of vehicles, people mover, the pods, then there's also a clear effect on climate change. And as I said, I see a lot of improvement potential going forward.
Thanks. Owen, it's interesting. Somebody from the audience is challenging you a little bit on the recycling perspective that you just pointed out. Magnus is pointing out that as we're transitioning to battery electric vehicles, that means that we should also look at those vehicles to provide the recycled materials that we need to build new cars. But of course, these are only just now being introduced to market in larger volumes. So he's saying that if we would focus on those vehicles, you will only have enough recycled content from other cars by 2040 to really power your production processes. So wouldn't that mean that in the meanwhile, we still will have to look at mobility as a service and other models to make sure that we don't wait until 2040 before we've got any upscaled action?
Yes. To answer that simply, yes, I agree. We have to focus the recycled content on increasing in the high quantity materials where we have steel, aluminium, copper, plastic, and then try as best as possible to have closed or as short loops as possible with battery materials, with the knowledge that the target for 2030 is incredibly challenging, especially if it's post-consumer. And then the request comes, well, do we have the facilities in Europe to make that an efficient system? The answer is no. To be honest, I think we need much more advanced end-of-life vehicle treatment processing. And then I would say the bit that's missing in this dialogue is electronics. It's really complicated. So batteries are actually pretty simple. You know, the systems are quite well established, and it's pretty doable. It's quite a good system. When we come to electronics, firstly, it's an incredibly complicated value chain to get to us. It's hugely carbon intensive. I think that we've looked in like Gabby software, and our footprint is something like 380 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of electronics. And we've been shown by people that could be a major underestimation. So that's the box that I think is really worth asking a question about. How do we deal with electronics in Europe and processing them efficiently rather than just smelting them and getting a bit of gold and copper out? So I completely agree with the question. Yes, we need to focus on all the other things. The one challenge that I think that's worth mentioning about the automotive sector is the lag. And the lag here is about 5 years. So what we're saying today is only going to come into effect, and the real leverage that we have is only going to come into effect in about 5 years. And what we're dealing with, the new vehicle, the EX90 that came on the market, was basically designed and put on the drawing pad about 5 years ago. And so we have to start thinking, okay, so what's the best that we're going to be able to do in 5 years from today? Clearly, there's not going to be enough electric infrastructure and batteries coming off the market. We hope there's not enough batteries coming off the market to feed our recycled content. So we're going to have to find ways to ensure that all the lithium and cobalt and nickel is circulated in the most efficient way. But I think that we really need to take a long, hard look at the European infrastructure and ask how, as an automotive sector, we are set up or we are not set up to deal with the large quantities that will be coming off the market from 2030 and 2033 in our estimation.
So would you say that in Brussels and elsewhere in the boardrooms, there's already a lot of action happening on trying to design that new recycling system and getting that more efficient? Or is that, are we only just starting looking at it?
It's probably one to you, Bjorn. You go in more boardrooms than I do.
Actually, I don't see it yet. It's, in my opinion, it's really just starting. So OEMs, but also other companies along the value chain have not been focusing on that part. So there's so many other things. And I think this is really something that just picks up now, since people see the value in it, but it's really at the beginning. So there's a long way to go, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, and then I must say that also looking at the report, but also from my practical experience, we're talking about such massive volumes, of course. I mean, with going to battery electric vehicles, that also needs a lot of replenishment of the current fleet out there. That I think we're looking at quite a challenge as well. And I'm happy to see that together with Bain, but also with you, Owen, and Volvo and some other OEMs, there is finally some traction there. Even if it's not at a COP, then at least with the businesses themselves this time leading the fray. But I do see that we need a lot of things happening. And now a question to both of you, Bjorn and Owen. We discussed about the challenges of going to mobility as a service models. We've discussed some of the challenges at end of life. What are these indeed the two main challenges, or is it even more complex? For instance, I can imagine that in automotive, value chain collaboration also will need to change. Different ways of working together, different ways of interacting with the customers will need to change. So I'm looking more at the social side of things. How big is the challenge at that front?
Yeah, it's massive. I think I've been in several sort of workshops with organizations in our supply chain, and I always ask the question, how many of you had an SUV 5 years ago? How many of you have an SUV now? And quite a lot of hands usually go up. So we're moving to bigger, worse, environmentally impactful cars. And then you ask the question, okay, so how many, it's very easy for us and the people on the questions there about mobility as a service. There are economic issues, there are systemic issues, there are infrastructure issues. put those to one side for a second, and then you sort of think, how many of us on the call would actually change the way that we get into work by using a mobility solution? And most people say, well, it's not really for me, it's for the young people, you know, the ones that live in the cities, you know. I don't put myself in a category of either young or living in a city, but then you ask, okay, so are you going to share your car with your neighbors? You know, people, it's really complex, the challenge that's being asked of us. And I think until this is a really tough one, because you've got to get down, it's a bit soul searching. You get to the point where you say, well, okay, it's only when the cost of externalities are put onto the products and put onto the fuel and put onto us as consumers that we will really change that behavior. When it doesn't cost 20 SEK per litre, which is about €2 per litre to buy fuel, but it's €4, maybe I will not work from the office 3 days a week. And you know, these are real fundamental changes, and it's only when the cost of externalities beyond carbon are included that we'll actually be able to have these dialogues, I think, really, really effectively. And it's an unfortunate situation that we can't be more proactive and do it because we see the benefits, and actually we're going to get a bit more of a stick probably to get the population to move in this direction. And I'm not a pessimist, but that does worry me a little bit, because it seems to be the same situation when you raise it in any room, whether it's a bunch of circular economy sort of fans, or when you talk to people that don't care. I don't know. What do you think, Bjorn?
I mean, you just mentioned the younger generation, and honestly, I clearly see a shift. Yeah? I see a dramatic shift. If I look just in our company, how many people vote for a company car? Yeah? When I joined, and in the past, everybody would just have a company car, and it's a huge selling argument in recruiting. And so today, it's less than 5%. Yeah, so it's really
okay.
We give people the chance, and basically, what we do is we offer a company car and a mobility budget, and all the new joiners, almost all of them, are going for the mobility budget. Yeah? So they can go to a car rental company and get a car for the weekend, but they can also use public transport. They can use car sharing and all the other mobility service, and quite flexibly. And this flexibility is such a high value for the younger generation, at least in urban areas. I clearly see a dramatic mind shift. And I think so with the shift in the generation, in the mindset in society, and if we then have the right offering to really offer services to these types of people, I really see a good chance that we move to the right direction. But I fully also see your argument. In general, so looking at the society as a whole, it's still a long way to go. And there's also the other shift that you just mentioned towards bigger vehicles, with electrification vehicles getting more heavy and all that like. So it's really both sides that I can see. What is really interesting, and what I see as a key advantage going forward, is that especially the younger, the upcoming generations are a lot more mindful and really tend to being quite sensitive about the topic, and really go for more mobility solutions instead of having cars parked in front of the house.
Thanks. I think we have to close in a couple of minutes. But Björn, I'm going to challenge you one last time, also with one question of the audience on you being an advisor to many OEMs and seeing this change also with your own with the younger generation. What would be your advice? What expectations would you raise with your clients? Where will you say, okay, this is, I do understand your struggles, but this is what you need to do to start doing tomorrow? Can you put it, I know I'm challenging you here, but can you put it to one clear recommendation for Owen and his colleagues?
Yes. I would really recommend to be active and to really advance on both sides. Yeah, one, traditional vehicle manufacturing, passenger cars, really focusing on being truly circular, not only recycling the cars, but really being truly circular from the beginning to the end. And making sure that all the materials basically stay in the value chain. But on the other side, to also focus a lot stronger than we see it now with many OEMs on new business models, new sustainable business models, like car sharing, but then also like the subscription service and other service models, and to really provide a good selection and attractive offering to the customers. And then I'm pretty confident that a lot of them will also move in that direction.
Owen, I can see you nodding, so I think you're already working on some parts of that, aren't you?
Quite reassuring. It's quite reassuring. They are the sort of things that we're trying, but I think it is it's a big task. It's a very big task. We as an industry need to work more collaboratively, and I really do think that if we can accelerate end of life of vehicle processing more effectively and close more loops, auto to auto, I mean, that would encourage us to look beyond sort of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years.
Well, okay, thanks. I think our time is up. Owen, Björn, thank you so much for the engaging discussion. I'm really happy that you were willing to join us today and share your insights. I hope the audience found it as insightful as I had. I really like also how we focused on a very different array of solutions: end of life, beginning of life, use phase. And I think we all shared a sense of urgency, but also recognize that it's going to be a challenge. I like your last comment, Owen, that I also feel and see in practice how much collaboration is also needed for that, not just among, say, the people we've got in the room here, but also value chain collaboration even with customers. So I think that's also a nice ending note for this session, that we invite everybody here also in the call to just connect and work together to make this possible, because the challenges are big, but the urgency is also very much there. Yeah, and for those that haven't seen yet in the chat, of course, we're very happy to point you towards the report itself, read up, or feel free to connect to either Björn, myself, or Owen for more engagements. Thank you so much for tuning in today, to listening to us, and let's make sure we all contribute to that transition that we need to have there. Thanks, everybody, and I hope I see you in the next sessions later today.
Thank you.
Thank you.